This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. I'm continuing today, which is not quite yet to Women's Equality Day, which is on August 26th, and this is only the 22nd right now. But I'm getting on with the story about the history of women's suffrage and how the 19th Amendment came to finally be adopted in the year 1920. One of the things that I've talked about in earlier programs was the first convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, and then the fact that we had our first convention here in Ohio in 1850, and I have my bag, which I showed last week, which shows a woman with I believe a bugle there. Yes, she's got both a bugle and a banner. Let's see if I can hold it up so that you can see the banner and the bugle and the woman. And she is hailing the coming of the effort for women's suffrage, women getting the right to vote. In 1850, as I mentioned, at Salem, Ohio, over in the eastern part of the state, near the Pennsylvania border, was the location of the first Women's Rights Conference in Ohio. And the very next year, in 1851, was the one that was presided over by Southeast Ohio activist Frances Dana Gage. And that was the one where Sojourner Truth made that famous speech, "Ain't I a woman, and you want to know why can't I? Since I can eat as much as a man and do as much work as a man." And she was a very tall Negro woman, 6 feet tall, they say, who had been born a slave in the state of New York in the times when New York still had slavery in the late 18th century. And she was a slave until New York declared slavery at an end, which was 1827. But she became this itinerant preacher, and she showed up at the Second Women's Rights Conference in Akron in 1851 and helped the women focus on the idea of trying to get more rights for women. In fact, she said, after the women had been lectured by some ministers about Eve and Eve's sin bringing down all these problems for mankind, and therefore that's why men should be in charge and so forth and so on. And Sojourner Truth said something like, well, if one woman could have upset the whole world way back then, maybe these women here today ought to try to set things right side up again. And she was cheered by the women there for making that comment. And then there was another minister there who said, Christ had no disciples who were women, so that's why the women really don't have any role to play in the church and so forth. And Sojourner Truth pointed out that as far as Jesus Christ was concerned, God and a woman made him possible. Man had nothing to do with it. That was another point. Actually, that point was something that was reported by several people who had heard her speak. Of course, there was no recording equipment in those days, and so whatever the reporters who happened to remember that speech she said, but there were some differences. But that was one thing that was definitely clear in both accounts that I've read of what Sojourner Truth had to speak, pointing out that Christ was born of a woman and God, and man had nothing to do with it at that point. So anyway, the women's rights effort continued in Ohio, and there were people that I mentioned in an earlier program, like Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and Olympia Brown, who were products of Ohio colleges, Oberlin in the case of Antoinette Brown Blackwell, Antioch College in the case of Olympia Brown. And both of those women were quite active in addition to being ministers, pioneer ministers at that, as women, among the very first women ministers. They were also active in Ohio, and I think, in fact, they said that Olympia Brown herself worked after she finished it at Antioch in 1860 for a couple of years on women's suffrage concerns. Well, to continue with the story, there were some changes made in the 1850s. In some states, women got more rights over their own wages. They didn't have to always turn them over to their husbands, for instance, married women, or their fathers or brothers if they were unmarried women. And so there were some changes that were made in some of the states, at least, for women's rights concerns. But the biggest and the gathering conflict really was the American Civil War, which broke out in 1861 and had been led up to by things like the passage of the anti-free blacks, you might say, in such a way as a woman who worked in Ohio, who was a black woman, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, but born of a free black family in the state of Maryland. After the passage of that fugitive slave law, she could no longer feel safe in Maryland because there were people who were capturing free blacks and selling them into slavery in the South. Just kidnapping them and so on. So Frances Ellen Watkins Harper had to move on, as she did, and she actually wound up in 1860 here in Ohio. She married an Ohioan and lived during the Civil War itself. She was living on a little farm as a farm wife near Columbus, Ohio. But she was a woman who had already published a book of poetry and a short story and had spoken both for abolition of slavery and also for women's rights across the Northeast in Maine and as far west as Ohio before the outbreak of the Civil War and before she got married. And like I say, a lot of other things were going on at that time, namely the war itself during that time in Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's life. But after the Civil War, she continued with her writing and publishing and lecturing. She made quite a trip throughout the South, actually, and she spoke to many black audiences. She never charged for those black audiences that she spoke to about women's rights and the rights of freed people. And it's interesting, too, that when the controversy erupted about suffrage in the Constitution, and that was due to the proposal of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the federal Constitution, the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery as such. The 14th Amendment was was broader, in fact, and asserted federal prerogatives over the states because, of course, one of the prime arguments that had been given for slavery in the past, before the Civil War, was states' rights, that southern states where slavery was legal should not be fooled with by the federal government. However, the 14th Amendment made it clear that the federal government had certain rights over the states, and that was putting into the Constitution the fact of what happened by the Civil War itself. However, that was not an easy thing to accept, and of course the people who were very firm and strong on states' rights, especially the southern states, didn't give up that argument easily. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper herself, when she was back on the lecture trail, went to an early women's rights convention shortly after the Civil War, and since there was this argument, well, what about women's rights? And some of the women who'd been proposing the vote for women were unhappy with the 14th Amendment, because that was the first time in American history and constitutional history that the word male was even put in the Constitution. The original Constitution, as it was written in 1787, did not refer to who was to have the elective franchise, and it certainly didn't specify that it was men only or even men of property. Those laws were passed later by Congress and by the states as to who should have the electoral franchise. And in fact, there were, in the early days of New Jersey, under the American Constitution, until about the early 1800s, women could vote. Women could vote in New Jersey. In those days, what they had was you had to have property, you had to have, be a taxpayer, that sort of thing, in order to be able to vote. Well, if there were women in New Jersey at the time who had property and so on, they were able to vote until New Jersey purposely went along with all the rest of the country and made the elective franchise exclusively for men. So when Frances Ellen Watkins Harper heard about this controversy over the 14th Amendment and the fact that it specified male, but in the first part of the 14th Amendment, it said that people who are born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. So, but then in the second part of the 14th Amendment, it said that it talked about males being necessary to vote. So, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's point was, well, this is the Negro's hour, and I would like to be able to vote as a woman, but it's more important right now that the Negro men get the elective franchise and get to vote like all the other men who are citizens who were born in this country or naturalized. So she went along with it, and so did most black proponents of the 14th Amendment. But there were people, this was, bad news as far as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Francis Dana Gage and people like that were concerned. It was bad news that for the first time the U.S. Constitution said that it was only males who could vote. And so they were trying to get around it for a number of years. They tried really to get around it by pointing out that they were citizens, natural-born citizens. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, born in New York State, Francis Dana Gage, born here in southeast Ohio and Washington County and so on. So they said, well, we're citizens. Why can't we vote? That should be a right and a duty of citizens, not just a privilege which is granted by the states, of being able to vote, especially if you are a taxpayer. And didn't we fight the American Revolution to free ourselves from the English, who wouldn't let the people who had property and had to pay taxes in the colonial days? It didn't the whole revolution, wasn't that about no taxation without representation? The fact that the colonists could not vote on things like the Stamp Act, that was what had brought on the American Revolution in the first place in the 1770s. Well, the women stuck to that argument for a while, and they really consciously tried, a number of women in different parts of the country and so on. It wasn't just a few women or just the well-known people to history like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony who attempted to vote. It was a number of other women around the country attempted to vote. In 1869, there was a woman in Missouri who was very strong. She and her husband both were very strong women's rights to vote proponents. And she went to try to vote, but she was denied, and so she brought a case against, I don't think she brought it right then in 1869, but she did bring it later on. She brought a case which eventually went to the Supreme Court in the 1870s, and the Supreme Court turned her down. And it was said, well, the 14th Amendment isn't really all that strong. It says that people are citizens, but where does it say in the Constitution? It doesn't even talk about voting, as a matter of fact. It doesn't say anything about who could vote or couldn't vote in the Constitution as written in 1787. And so it was under Supreme Court dicta during the 1870s that women were denied the right to vote that they had tried to assert. And it's quite interesting too, you know, there was an effort for a number of years by people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the 1850s to get some hearing in Congress about the question of women voting. But there had never been anyone who had spoken like to a congressional committee about voting or whether women should vote or how they could vote and so on. The very first one, actually, in January of 1871, the first woman who made a presentation before a congressional committee urging the right and duty of women to vote was a woman from Ohio, born not too far from here. She was born in Licking County, and she was a rather strange woman, you might say, quite ahead of her time. Her name was Victoria Woodhull, and in January 1871, she and her sister, Tennessee Claflin, were stockbrokers, the first women stockbrokers on the New York Stock Exchange in New York. And she was a person who supported women's right to vote, and she had powerful sponsors who had helped her to put up her brokerage house in New York, and helped her to print a paper called the Woodhull and Claflin Weekly. This was a little later on, but she had this powerful sponsor. And so she was invited to speak before a congressional committee that was concerned with voting rights. And so she gave quite a powerful presentation But essentially it was on the lines of, well, the 14th Amendment has made women citizens since they're natural born, and if they aren't, if they're naturalized citizens, then why shouldn't they be permitted to vote? And she was pretty persuasive, and she persuaded some people, but not enough, obviously, to go along with her. This was in 1871, and she sort of came out of the blue as far as old-timers in the women's rights movement were concerned, but they were glad when she spoke up. However, it was later pointed out by opponents of women's suffrage that Victoria Woodhull was a rather questionable person. She was not quite the perfect, demure, moralistic woman that was the sort of woman that got set on a pedestal by the men for her purity and so on. She came from a family. The father was, you might say, a snake oil salesman. She herself had peddled snake oil as a girl when she was with her parents' family, although she married early and sort of escaped them for a while. But Victoria Woodhull was a believer in free love. That is to say, she thought that the morals of the 19th century were a little too strong on women, made it very difficult to get divorces. Women couldn't even sue for divorce because of the fact that they were women. The only person who could get a divorce really was a man in those days. So it was pointed out that she was a believer in free love. Oh dear, you know. And she had an unusual family situation. By that time, she was living in New York City with her stockbrokering firm and so on. Many of her family members were there. I'm not sure whether her mother was still alive, but I'm pretty sure her father was. And she had been married. She was on her second marriage. She had been married before. And her former husband, from whom she was divorced, was a member of the household. I guess she had a big apartment, and he had a room in it. Anyway, people were saying, what the heck's going on with this woman? This is just not the usual sort of family that is the American ideal. And for her to say that, as she did, she said something like, you know, people should stay married if they're in love and they're getting along well and so forth and so on. And it shouldn't be so hard to break the marriage bond and get a divorce or even get married at all for that matter. Well, obviously that was held against her by many people, including many in the women's suffrage movement itself. I mean, here's people like Frances Dana Gage, who was the mother of 8 children and still married to her husband until he unfortunately died, you know. Or someone like, for that matter, Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself, who had been the mother of at least 7 children, 5 of whom were boys, and was still married to her husband and so on, and believed in the marital bounds and what have you. So many of now, someone like Susan B. Anthony never married at all, and probably it was because she wanted to avoid getting into this situation which 19th century women had, that at least in 1840, most of the American women had this situation where upon marriage, they became one with their husband, and the husband was in charge. There was no question who was in charge in this partnership. It was definitely the husband, and he was, you know, he could take the wife's wages and even beat her and so forth. administer chastisement, they said. I mean, they made it sound a little bit better than beating. But there were a lot of women who did suffer, especially in those intemperate days when liquor was relatively cheap and available, and some men didn't even get home with their wages. They drank it all up in the saloon on the way home, which was one of the big reasons why a lot of women backed temperance on hard drink. And in fact, in the 1870s, a movement got started called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which was very hard on strong drink, you know, and so on. But, and that was one of Frances Dana Gage's triune cause, because she not only believed in abolition and women's rights, but she also believed in temperance. Although, as far as we know, she had a temperate husband. Maybe she just had seen too many women who didn't have temperate husbands. Anyhow, so in 1871, Victoria Woodhull sort of came from nowhere, made a very persuasive speech to the Congressional Committee, the first one ever made by a woman on the subject of women's rights, or I guess on any subject at all in Congress. And then people began pointing out that she had an unusual background, and maybe we should be suspicious of a woman like this. And the women's rights for voting themselves found that kind of a curious thing. Well, there were efforts made on a state-by-state basis, especially after the failure of some of these arguments about citizenship didn't necessarily mean the right to vote under the dictates of the Supreme Court in the 1870s. But there were these state campaigns. One of the very first of them happened really shortly after the Civil War itself, while they were still debating about the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and before they were actually ratified and made a part of the Constitution, there was a big campaign in Kansas. Now, Kansas had played a big role in the coming of the Civil War, if you'll remember, because John Brown, who was the fiery abolitionist, was part of the effort that was made in the middle of the 1850s when Kansas became a territory. John Brown was there trying to make Kansas a free state, and there were a lot of people there from slave states that had moved over, like Missouri, which is right next door and was a slave state, to make slavery legal in Kansas. And that's where John Brown got his whole first beginning. And then, you know, later on, he was the guy who torched the American Civil War in a way, because of the raid that he made on Harper's Ferry late in 1859, and trying to arm blacks and so on, and was captured and was hanged. And the whole story, you know, the whole song about John Brown's body lie moldering in the grave, but his spirit goes marching on, came out of that episode in the Civil War. Well, after the Civil War was over in 1867, Kansas was going through another troubled period because it was getting ready to become a state. And having the statehood and having a big election coming up, there were several items on the ballot, one of which was suffrage for women, and one of which was suffrage for blacks. And in 1867, Susan B. Anthony and others who were very active in the women's rights movement went to Kansas and toured the state speaking up for women's suffrage because it was going to be on the fall ballot there in Kansas. And at the same time, they had another effort being made to make sure that black men could vote in Kansas, because this was before the actual passage of the 15th Amendment. So this became quite a big issue in Kansas, and it was a place that people went to and canvassed the whole state, trying to get their point of view accepted by the all-male, of course, electorate. Well, as a matter of fact, Frances Dana Gage herself had planned to go to Kansas to help out with that whole effort, and she had her bags all packed, but she'd had a serious carriage accident during the Civil War, which had left her partially crippled up, and then in 1867, just before she was heading out to Kansas to help with the passage of women's suffrage for the state of Kansas, she suffered a stroke and was not able to go, and was in fact an invalid for the rest of her life, cared for by a couple of her daughters. She had 6 sons in addition, so maybe some of the Gages that people know, G-A-G-E, in this territory are related to Frances Dana Gage, who lived in McConnellsville for many years. But anyway, what finally happened in Kansas when they had the election was both women's suffrage went down and also suffrage for black men. But like I say, that was before the passage of the 15th Amendment, which was didn't say anything about males, but it said that that the electoral franchise could not be withheld because of previous condition of servitude. In other words, that former slaves would be able to vote. Now, maybe only men, obviously, at the time, but that slavery itself could not be argued against granting the electoral franchise. So I guess the men in Kansas had to let the blacks vote after the passage of the 15th Amendment, although they didn't have to do it in 1867. Well, anyway, in 1872 they had a pretty there was an election. Of course, that was the election where Ulysses S. Grant, the famous general who was born in southern Ohio and became such a hero in the northern cause during the Civil War, that was when he was running to become President of the United States in 1867, and pardon me, in 1872. So, but there were others in the race as well. One of the people in the race was Horace Greeley, who was a Republican in New York. And Horace Greeley was, although he was a pretty progressive fellow, was not in favor of woman suffrage. So it wound up that a number of people voted, who tried to vote at any rate for somebody in the 1872 election, tried to vote for Ulysses S. Grant. And in fact, some of the well-known women's rights for women and asking for the electoral franchise worked on campaigns to get Grant elected. Not that it made any difference to, as far as I know, he never particularly had any great love for votes for women. But in any case, that was also the election where Victoria Woodhull put her name forward for President of the United States. And interestingly, she wasn't even old enough to be officially elected, because the U.S. Constitution does say that a person who becomes president must be 35 years of age or older, and the time in 1872. She was only 34 years old, but she put her name forward anyway. But there was this big hoopla about her unconventional lifestyle and so on. And she, of course, had no chance. I don't think she had a single electoral vote when they came to count the electoral votes after the 1872 election, where Grant was made the president. However, that was also an election where Susan B. Anthony tried to vote. She and a bunch of her neighbor women in Rochester, New York, went to the polls and said, well, the 14th Amendment says that we are natural-born citizens of the United States, and so we're here to vote. We should be permitted to vote. Now, the man in charge at the election place said, no, wait a minute, you can't vote. Or I guess maybe what actually happened was that the place where they went to, the men actually took the votes, but kept them separate, didn't put them in the same box with all the other things. They put the women's votes separately and took them downtown, and the people downtown said, no, wait a minute, these are women. Women can't vote. And they tossed it out. And she was arrested. Susan B. Anthony was arrested for trying to vote in 1872. So when her trial time came up early in 1873, I guess it was sometime, a newly named Supreme Court justice, who must have been probably from New York State and was convenient to hand, was the person who ran the trial of Susan B. Anthony, which was not held in Rochester, where she lived and where people knew her, quite well, and many of them sympathized with her. But they put the trial in a different county, maybe the county that this new Supreme Court justice came from. And there was no trial, okay? Well, for one thing, she would have objected because trial is supposed to be by your peers. Trial by your peers. Well, what does that mean? Only men could be on juries in those days, and she was a woman. This was another one of these arguments, about the unfairness of the whole setup. How could you have a jury of your peers if women were excluded from juries entirely, and a woman was charged with some crime? The crime in her case was attempting to vote illegally. So anyway, the judge said, okay, we won't have any trial. I just declare that you are guilty and you will have to pay a $100 fine. Susan B. Anthony said, no way, I'm never going to pay that fine, and she never did. And of course, it never really came up as far as disqualifying her to vote, because she died in 1906, and women's suffrage did not become national until 1920. So that fact never came out. Well, anyway, as I say, there were these efforts. Finally, the women's suffrage movement split into two groups, actually, between those who wanted to work on the national level, on the federal level. That was Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friends in the National Suffrage Women's Association. And the women who decided that the way to go was to go state by state and get the various states, if the states were in charge of deciding who could be an elector, then let's go to the states and get the states to agree to let women vote. Well, there was already a territory where women could vote. That territory was Wyoming Territory. And later on, actually, it became a territory like in 1869, and women had the right to vote. It's not too clear how many women actually voted they weren't keeping statistics about things like that in those days, I guess. But women could vote in the territory of Wyoming for many years. And in fact, finally, when it came to the fact of Wyoming becoming a state, more than a territory, because you had to have at least 50,000 people in those days to become a state. And Wyoming wasn't, I guess, ready to even talk about statehood until they got a larger population. But interestingly enough, Wyoming was one of the first states that actually permitted women to vote. The national people who were opposed to women's suffrage tried to force the people in Wyoming, the all-male, I guess it was, as it turned out, in terms of the officials in the state of Wyoming, to get them to change and have Wyoming, like all the other states in the U.S., be a state where only men could vote. They tried to make this change on the people in Wyoming, but the people in Wyoming had already voted for a constitution which included women's suffrage. And the men, in a great show of sticking to your principles, said, well, if the women can't vote, we won't become a state. And the people in Congress decided, well, okay, I guess we can let these people in Wyoming who seem to insist on letting women vote, I guess we can let them come in as a state even though they do permit women to vote. And so Wyoming came in as a suffrage state. One of four, all in the far west, that accepted women's suffrage before the coming of the 20th century. I guess the last one that actually was voted in was in Idaho, probably 1896. So, who were some of the people who opposed women's right to vote? Well, one of the key groups that apparently opposed, at least in terms of money, money in elections, we're already back to very controversial times over this question of money in elections and who can give money and how much and must it be public, who gives it, and that sort of thing. And the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court in 2010 said that these limits were unfair, that there were unfair limits, and so that wealthy people could support elections that were more, instead of being kept to, I'm not sure what the overall limit was, but it was something like $200,000 in an election. Well, you could give money to different, this would only hold for like one candidate. You could keep on giving money. If you had another $200,000 to give or whatever, you could keep on giving to other candidates. That's essentially what Citizens United has permitted. And that's why there have been millions and millions of dollars spent on elections. In 2012, there were millions and millions of dollars spent on elections, and nearly all of the really big money was Republican money, like from the Koch brothers and so on, well-to-do millionaires and billionaires who were supporting Republican candidates. And actually, as far as the presidency, it didn't work because President Obama was reelected in spite of all the millions and billions of dollars that were poured into a campaign, because enough people got out, voters got out to vote to elect him, re-elect him as president. Well, there were questions about where is the money coming from for elections. And in fact, one of the arguments against letting women vote in the first place was politics is a dirty business. You know, these guys making deals down in bars and so forth and so on. And we don't want our women folk involved in such a messy, dirty business as politics in the first place. People were buying votes, so to speak. You know, if someone was a good old guy who gave you a turkey at Thanksgiving, you were likely to vote for his candidate, even though maybe he couldn't tell whether you voted or not, at least after the secret ballot was brought in. But there were plenty of people in the old days who, quote, sold their vote in a sense by accepting liquor or turkeys at Thanksgiving or whatever. That was part of the dirtiness of politics, that women were too pure and refined and so on to be exposed to, some men said, and some women too for that matter. Interestingly enough, in 1896, there was on the California ballot, and of course California was a western state, and there were now 4 western states that permitted women's suffrage by 1896. There was a provision on the ballot that would have permitted women to vote. Now, the women couldn't vote on these provisions, of course, because in states where women couldn't vote, they couldn't vote. And all the voters who had to vote for women to vote were actually men. So in 1896, in the state of California, which had women's suffrage on the ballot, it was interesting. You know, where did the money come from? Well, there were some well-known and conservative Republican women who supported suffrage. One of them was Mrs. Leland Stanford, whose husband had been governor and then senator from the state of California, and who was a well-to-do man. They were originally from New York State. And in fact, she was a person who used to give Susan B. Anthony free tickets to ride on the railroad train sometimes. Anyway, she was one of the backers of women's suffrage in the state of California, and another one was Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, who was owned the Hearst newspapers and was a conservative Republican and so on, and she was one of the other backers of women's suffrage who gave some money for that campaign. But a couple of weeks before the election, the liquor interests suddenly realized that maybe this would pass. And they were afraid that if women would vote, that they would vote for temperance, that they would vote against liquor, they would make it tough on the bars and so forth. And so they began a big campaign, but in only 2 counties, just in San Francisco and Alameda across the bay. They put on this huge campaign to get out the male vote, to not have women vote because of this liquor question. And interestingly enough, when the ballots were counted in the fall of 1896, women's suffrage question in California had gone down to defeat, but only very narrowly. And actually, every county in California except for San Francisco and Alameda, where the liquor people had put in all these ads against women's suffrage, those were the only 2 counties that had this, this huge winning vote against women's suffrage. So it was pretty clear that the liquor interests were among those that were opposed to women's suffrage becoming law. Still, in 1911, California finally became a women's suffrage state. And gradually there were more and more. And there were even some places, like Ohio, that permitted women to vote on certain in certain elections. One of the elections where they were permitted to vote in Ohio, and that was passed in 1894, was school board, because they said, well, you know, the mothers and so on are sending their children to school, and so they will be interested in school affairs. And Ohio passed a law saying that women could vote for the school board. And interestingly, on the first election after this passage of this law in Ohio, 2 women were elected to the school board in Athens City, and they were the first women who were members of a school board in the Athens County in 1894 because of that passage. Also, later on, there were, before the passage of the 20th, in 1920, of the 19th Amendment, there were as many as 8 states that had just passed a law in 1919 permitting women to vote for president. Ohio was one of them, as a matter of fact. So that there were a number of states, in this case they were almost all Midwestern and Eastern states that permitted women to vote for president in 1919. Of course, there wasn't going to be an election until 1920. And by then, there was this big passage of the 19th Amendment, which in itself is a fascinating story. And I shall hope to be able to give you that story in greater detail in a future program, because it was really fascinating. That was in the state of Tennessee, that in August of 1920 became the ratifying state. That meant that there were enough states that had passed the 19th Amendment that it became part of the law of the land in the Constitution. So we will take a stronger look at that the next time that I speak about women's suffrage. And in the meantime, just remember that August 26th, coming up in just a couple of days, and before this show airs, because we'll have another show that will air before this show. So it will be after August 26th, I suppose, that you will get just this particular emphasis on August 26th, Women's Equality Day, because of the passage of the 19th Amendment saying that women should be permitted to vote, that voting should not be prohibited on account of sex, okay? That was the wording in 1878, the first time that this amendment was proposed, and it was over 50 years before that amendment became a part of the Constitution. And those of you will remember that 1878 actually was the same year that Susan B. Anthony actually spoke in Athens, Ohio. Just a couple of months after what has become known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to the Constitution was finally ratified on August 26th in 1920. But she spoke here in 1878, 50 years earlier, and long after Susan B. Anthony herself was dead. And that, of course, that amendment had to be proposed in the U.S. Congress by a man. There were men who all along were supporters and backers of suffrage for women, women's rights, and the right to the electoral franchise, which also helps to mean that since juries are selected from voters, that your peers would be among the jury selection group, that women would be in the jury pool, so that women would have a chance to be, if they were on trial for something, would have the opportunity of having a jury of their peers. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.